The fluorescent lights inside the downtown call center buzzed faintly above rows of identical cubicles, where underpaid agents spoke into headsets with voices carefully trained to sound neutral, friendly, and above all, American. Among them sat Naomi, a black single mother whose voice never quite blended into the crowd. Her accent, shaped by her West African roots, wasn't loud or thick, but it carried a melody that stood out in a world built to suppress difference. Her tone was warm, her articulation flawless, but her voice still raised eyebrows behind closed doors. Naomi had been at the job for 6 months, never arriving late, never missing a deadline, and never raising her voice even when insulted by customers. The job was far from glamorous, but it paid just enough to keep her and her 5-year-old son, Jaden, in a 1-bedroom apartment with flickering lights and a stubborn radiator that worked only when it wanted to. Each morning, she left the apartment, before the sun rose, walking Jaden to daycare with his tiny hand tucked in hers. She wore her best blouse and combed her hair tightly into a bun, not because anyone noticed, but because she believed in dignity even when the world didn't return it. She often skipped lunch to save money and took short bathroom breaks to avoid suspicion. Her life was built on quiet endurance, and her only luxury was the photo of Jaden she kept taped to her computer monitor. She rarely looked at it during work hours. She couldn't afford distraction. That Friday morning started no differently. The air inside the office was dry, the same stale coffee scent lingered in the hallway, and her headset crackled like always. Call after call, she followed the script, apologized when customers were rude, remained calm when they cursed, smiled, even when she was alone. Then came the call that changed everything. A customer complained not about service, not about wait times, but about the accent. Naomi had answered questions accurately, resolved the issue, and even documented the complaint. But that wasn't enough. Within an hour, her supervisor appeared by her cubicle, face tight with disapproval. Naomi was asked to step away from her desk. In a cramped office that smelled of paper and old toner, she was told her communication style didn't align with the company's standard. She was fired. Just like that. No final warning. No second chance. Just a cardboard box, a final paycheck, and a room full of people who looked away as she walked out. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't cry. Not yet. What Naomi didn't know, what no one in that sterile, soulless office knew, was that someone had been watching. The billionaire founder of the company, visiting unannounced and dressed down in jeans and a hooded sweatshirt, had come that morning to quietly assess how his empire was functioning on the ground. He had chosen anonymity, blending in like a consultant in the lobby, observing the flow of people, the tone of managers, the culture he had helped create. He heard Naomi's voice during a routine call monitoring session, and something about it had made him pause. Not just the accent, but the clarity, the empathy, the steadiness. When she was called into the office, he followed discreetly. He watched, and what he witnessed, the dismissal, the indifference, the bureaucratic cruelty, shook him in a way quarterly reports never had. While Naomi stood in the rain waiting for the city bus, soaked and silent with her box of belongings pressed to her chest, the billionaire returned to his top-floor suite with fire in his chest. There, he reviewed the footage again. He rewatched the call, reread the customer transcript. Then he called his executive team, not to brainstorm damage control, but to confront them with what they had allowed to grow unchecked in his company. He was a man who had built an empire on innovation, disruption, and diversity, or so the brochures said. But what good was a mission statement if women like Naomi could be erased for sounding different? That evening, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, her son asleep beside her. The box from work sat unopened in the corner. Her phone was silent. No apologies, no reconsiderations, just an inbox full of automated replies and job postings that offered less than what she had lost. She stared at the ceiling, too tired to scream, too numb to cry. Somewhere far above, in a penthouse lined with glass and steel, the man who had watched it all was already crafting a plan. Not for compensation, not for a PR stunt, but for restoration. The story had just begun. Naomi didn't sleep that night. The silence in her apartment felt heavier than usual, like it knew what had been taken from her. Her son, Jaden, slept peacefully beside her on their small mattress, unaware that the structure of their fragile world had begun to crack. Naomi stared at the peeling ceiling for hours, replaying the events at the office again and again. Every detail of that cold dismissal clung to her like second skin. The way her supervisor had refused to look her in the eye, how no one had said goodbye, and the way the word standard had been used like a blade. It was not her performance. They dismissed. It was her presence, her voice, her very identity, and it hurt more than any insult ever could. But Naomi didn't weep. She had learned long ago that in a world built to overlook people like her, tears were a luxury. She closed her eyes just before dawn, and when she woke again, nothing had changed. There was no phone call to take it back, no email to fix the damage, and no new money in her account. Across the city, inside a glass-walled executive suite, the Billionaire stood in front of a wall-length screen, arms crossed, rewatching the footage for the 5th time. The woman they had fired was unlike anyone he had heard in a long time, not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but because she carried something most of his top-paid professionals had lost: humanity. There had been something in Naomi's voice during that monitored call that stopped him mid-sip of his coffee. A grace that didn't waver under pressure, a dignity that refused to shrink. And when she had been fired, when she packed her things, in silence and when the manager rolled his eyes behind her back, something inside the Billionaire shifted. This wasn't just poor leadership. This was institutional failure. And worse, it had been hiding in plain sight under his name. By 9 a.m. that morning, the company's senior team had been summoned without warning. The head of HR arrived confused, legal counsel slightly panicked, and the COO visibly irritated. They weren't used to being pulled into emergency meetings without preparation. But when the footage was played, no one spoke. Not a single executive made eye contact with the founder, because they all knew. They had ignored complaints like this before. The accent issue had come up in whispers, in memos, in cultural fit, conversations that were always carefully worded but deeply biased. And Naomi had been their latest casualty. When the footage ended, the Billionaire turned around slowly and dropped a folder onto the table. It contained termination letters, already signed, for the supervisor who fired her and 2 middle managers who approved it without thought. Their positions were eliminated on the spot. The rest of the meeting wasn't about punishment, it was about policy. Change wasn't coming as a suggestion, it was coming like a storm. That same day, while Naomi scrolled job boards on her cracked second-hand phone, an unfamiliar number lit up the screen. She ignored it. Another scam, probably. But then another message came through, an address, a time, and a prepaid car service confirmation. The sender didn't introduce themselves. It wasn't from a recruiter or agency. It simply read, "Regarding your recent employment termination." She sat frozen. The words were vague but serious. She read them again, then looked toward the neat, unopened box of her work things in the corner. Her first instinct was distrust, but something in her gut nudged her forward. By early afternoon, a sleek black SUV rolled up outside her building. She stepped into it, dressed not in anything fancy, but in her best pressed blouse and the simple earrings her mother had given her years ago before she passed. Her palms were sweaty. Her heart pounded. The city passed by in gray blurs as the car climbed toward the wealthier districts, neighborhoods Naomi had only seen in magazine articles and elevator posters. The vehicle pulled into a circular drive, and a tall glass building towered above her like a monument to a world she had never been invited into. A woman with a tablet met her in the lobby, not overly friendly, but respectful. She was escorted through security and into a private elevator. No questions, no fingerprints, just a straight ride up. The doors opened into a sunlit boardroom that felt more like an art gallery than an office. And there, standing with his back to her, looking out over the city he ruled from above, was the billionaire. The same man who had sat quietly in the lobby of the call center days earlier. The man who had listened, watched, chosen not to interfere until now. Naomi was led to a seat. A folder was handed to her. It didn't contain a rehire offer. It contained something far greater. Inside was a newly drafted position, Head of Inclusive Talent Strategy, a role built around her lived experience. She would lead a newly created department focused on identifying, recruiting, and elevating minority voices across the company, from customer service to executive suites. She wouldn't just be employed, she'd be empowered. She wouldn't just be included. She'd be building the door for others to walk through. There was also a full-year salary included up front, a private mentorship program, and optional executive training abroad. It wasn't a handout. It was an invitation to change everything. Naomi held the folder in her hands and stared at it for what felt like hours. She thought of Jaden. She thought of her mother. She thought of every insult she had swallowed to keep her job. And now, here she was, standing not as a victim, but as the foundation of a revolution. Naomi walked out of that glass tower with a folder in her hand and fire in her chest. The sunlight hit differently on that side of the city. Everything seemed polished, precise, important. But Naomi didn't feel like an outsider anymore. For the first time since she'd arrived in America, she wasn't asking for a place at the table. She was being asked to design one. She sat in the back of the black SUV quietly, her fingers gently gripping the folder resting on her lap. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a platform. It was redemption. But most of all, it was responsibility. She could say no. She could walk away and never deal with this company again. But if she did that, how many more voices would be silenced like hers had been? How many women would get escorted out of glass buildings just for sounding like home? No, not this time. Naomi knew exactly what she needed to do. Back in her apartment, the lights flickered as always, and Jaden's laughter echoed from the corner of the room where he played with a toy truck with missing wheels. Naomi sat at the table, the folder open, papers spread like a puzzle she now had the courage to solve. The offer was real. The pay was more than she'd ever dreamed of. But what stood out most was the section titled Autonomy. It outlined her freedom to build her department from scratch. No interference. No pre-written scripts. She could hire her own team, set her own priorities, and, with final approval, propose mandatory policy changes across all departments. For a woman who had been discarded like static noise just days earlier, this was not just power. It was justice on paper. The following week, Naomi began her new role in silence. There was no company-wide email blast, no ribbon-cutting event. She requested that it start quietly, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to walk the halls and feel the truth. Unfiltered. She visited every department. She met the custodians, the cafeteria staff, the junior agents still answering, phones in gray cubicles. She listened. She took notes. She recognized the same tension in the air that once followed her like shadow. People still whispered when she passed, but now the tone had changed. There was curiosity, respect, fear, maybe. Naomi didn't care. She wasn't there to make anyone comfortable. She was there to make things right. Within a month, her department had a name, the Inclusion Corps. A team of 5, soon to become 15, worked under her to audit everything, from hiring practices to customer feedback analysis. She initiated an internal review system that elevated anonymous feedback from frontline workers directly to executive-level meetings. No filters, no spin. For the first time, janitors, receptionists, and temp workers had a direct channel to the top. She also partnered with the company's global offices to introduce regional training that celebrated, not muted, cultural accents, speech rhythms, and language diversity. But what shook the company most wasn't the programs. It was her presence. Naomi, a black single mother who once carried a termination letter in a cardboard box, now walked into executive meetings with purpose, and when she spoke, they listened. Because behind every decision she made, there was lived experience, real pain, real truth. She didn't bring statistics, she brought stories, like the Haitian immigrant who was told to speak English properly in the break room, or the Nigerian intern who was never invited to pitch meetings because her manager said her voice sounded too intense. Naomi collected them all like sacred records and turned them into blueprints for sweeping change. And still, she remained the same woman who woke early to iron her son's uniform. The same woman who packed sandwiches with off-brand peanut butter and paid bills 2 days before late fees kicked in. Power hadn't changed her. It had only clarified what she was always meant to be, a protector of those without platforms. Meanwhile, the billionaire watched from a distance, not because he doubted her, but because he understood something rare among men in his position. He knew when to step back. He read her reports with reverence, passed her policies without edits, and redirected executives to her when questions came that only she should answer. She had become not just a voice in the company, she had become its conscience. Then came the day her story went public. Not because she wanted it to, but because someone in marketing, deeply moved by the ripple effects of her work, wrote a feature article in the company's monthly newsletter. It was titled, "The Voice We Almost Silenced." Within days, it went viral. Other companies took notice. Universities called. Podcasts reached out. Naomi was suddenly seen by millions, not as a diversity hire, not as a corporate puppet, but as a leader, a pioneer, a mother who stood firm, an accent they could never mute again. But Naomi didn't chase the spotlight. She declined interviews. She said no to documentaries. She preferred the work. Quiet, focused, urgent. She knew the headlines would fade, but the system she was building needed to last beyond the moment. This wasn't about a feel-good redemption arc. It was about making sure the next Naomi never had to be redeemed. And in her apartment, not much had changed. The walls were still chipped, the kitchen faucet still leaked. But there was a new table by the window, a place where Naomi sat at night, reviewing names of applicants who had once been rejected for sounding different. Now, she was the one hiring them. The winter wind swept through the city like a blade, cold and unforgiving. But in the heart of the skyline where steel towers reached for the clouds, something had quietly begun to thaw. Inside the headquarters of a company once known only for profit margins and sterile corporate slogans, there now existed a floor that buzzed with purpose. It wasn't flashy, no marble, no art installations, but it was alive with empathy, urgency, and ideas. Naomi's team worked behind glass panels etched with simple words: equity, voice, change. Words that had once been thrown around like confetti now stood etched in steel. They were no longer ideals. They were policy. Naomi sat at her desk, back, straight, hands calmly folded as her team discussed a new initiative: recruiting call center talent from refugee support networks and immigrant aid organizations. She listened, asked questions, and made no fuss when her ideas were challenged. She had no interest in being untouchable. She had interest in being effective. Her son's photo still sat beside her monitor, the same photo she once packed in a cardboard box on the day she was fired. Now, it faced her like a mirror, reminding her who she was working for. Not just Jaden, but every woman with an accent, every underpaid mother, every immigrant who ever walked into an interview hiding part of herself to be accepted. The changes Naomi implemented didn't stop at her company's doors. Other firms started copying her initiatives. One created a training module based entirely on her team's materials. Another reached out to hire her as a consultant. She declined most offers, preferring to build deeper rather than wider. She understood the danger of surface change. Inclusion without accountability was just decoration. Naomi wanted no part in window dressing. She wanted structural transformation. And it showed. Under her leadership, the company launched the Accent Amplified campaign, a nationwide hiring effort that spotlighted multilingual call agents, featuring them proudly in advertisements, on websites, and even in customer hold music. For the first time, callers waiting in the queue didn't just hear elevator tunes, they heard voices from Ghana, Haiti, South Africa, and India sharing short, powerful stories of how they got here. What had once been silenced was now sung, but Naomi's work didn't stop in the boardroom. In her spare time, she volunteered to mentor high school students in underserved neighborhoods. She sat with girls who had learned to shrink their voices and boys told their dialects sounded ghetto. She taught them that clarity had nothing to do with conformity, that the world didn't need them to sound like someone else to be worthy of listening, that sometimes the very voice they were mocked for would become the one to shift nations. And as for Jaden, he blossomed. No longer a child growing up in uncertainty, he now thrived in a school with dedicated tutors, music programs, and teachers who knew his name. Naomi didn't tell him much about her journey. She didn't need to. He saw it every day when she came home, tired but glowing, when she sat with him doing homework at the same table where she had once cried in silence. The same table now held books on law, equity, and corporate ethics. She was even studying part-time, inching toward a graduate degree. Not for status, for legacy. The billionaire, meanwhile, remained in the background. He no longer walked the halls in disguise. He didn't need to. His transformation wasn't performative. It was permanent. The man who once believed quarterly growth defined success had learned a harder, richer truth. The real metric of leadership was who flourished under your roof and who was left behind. He met with Naomi only occasionally now, not because he had forgotten her, but because he trusted her. And when they did speak, it was brief, focused, and full of quiet mutual respect. He never tried to take credit for her work. He knew better. Naomi had not been saved by a billionaire. The company had been salvaged by her. One morning, Naomi arrived to find a package on her desk. No name. Just a plain white envelope with a handwritten note inside. It read, "For your voice, for our future." Inside was a single key, engraved, golden, and symbolic. The nameplate attached simply said, Naomi A. Dube Conference Center. The company had renamed one of its largest, gathering spaces in her honor, not for publicity, for permanence. When the ribbon was cut a week later, Naomi stood silently as staff, media, and executives applauded. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. Her work had already spoken for her. Later that night, back in her apartment with Jaden tucked under his covers and the city's lights blinking through the window, Naomi stood by the table where it had all begun. Her old call center headset still sat in a drawer, a relic of the time she was invisible. She held it in her hands, felt its weight, and remembered how small she had once felt wearing it. She set it down gently, then opened her laptop to review the next round of hires. More names, more chances, more voices. She didn't need revenge. She had rewritten the rules, and this time the world was listening.
If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more heartfelt stories to life, one soul at a time.